This episode is brought to you by Audi. The road is calling. Embrace the thrill of the drive with the all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron. Featuring effortless power, serious acceleration, and advanced Audi tech. It's not just a new EV, it's a new way to experience driving. The all-new, fully electric Audi Q6 e-tron is here. The next chapter of Audi starts now.
Saturday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength Saturday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Saturday. Saturday, bring it on.
You are tuned in to the Foul Weather Podcast, the forecast to your next successful hunt. Coming to you from the home office, Jack's Reef, New York. Today we welcome Ducks Unlimited Director of Agricultural and Sustainability Policy, Julia Peeples, with us. Julia has worked on Capitol Hill as a Senate advisor. She later moved into the hook and bullet sector of the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership, or TRCP, you'll hear it called as well. And then I'm actually going to let Julia tell me what BHA is. I found Bowhunters
Yeah,
something?
I mean, if you research BHA, you get a lot of those acronyms coming up. But Backcountry Hunters and Anglers, very.
Oh, good. Yeah. I found something different. So backcountry. Yeah. Thank
Happy
you.
you asked.
Right. So then Julia, after that, transitioned to Ducks Unlimited, was instrumental as well in the Great American Outdoors Act under the Trump administration, which helped improvements with national parks, national forests, and recreational areas. But this act also greatly improved funding for national wildlife refuges, right, to meet the needs of waterfowl throughout their annual cycle, from breeding grounds to migratory areas that they need to survive in the critical wintering areas so that we can send ducks back strong. Julia now serves as the primary voice for Ducks Unlimited on Capitol Hill in a very important time with the Farm Bill in the works. So the Farm Bill really influences how much habitat is on the landscape for waterfowl in the form of grasslands and wetlands. So we welcome Julia, but as on the pregame here, when we chatted, I said, we don't envy her position in the least. You have got a really heavy lift for the ducks and the duck people across duck country. So welcome, Julia, and thank you for all that you do for the ducks. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Mike, for allowing me to join you guys today, and appreciate that little rundown. I don't want to put myself all the pressure with me working on the Farm Bill solely for ducks. It takes a lot of people on our policy team and with our partners in the conservation space, but also the commodity world that really make this happen for us. So it's really exciting opportunity. I was telling Mike earlier, pre-podcast, that I'm happy you don't envy my job, because I love it and I get to keep it. So it's fun to strategize, know the tactics, and also really do great work through statute and through legislation for conservation. So I'm happy to be here. So really appreciate the time.
Yeah, it is pretty cool to have you, especially where we're at with the Farm Bill right now, right? And so there's a lot to unpack too about, your career to this point before working with DU for the Farm Bill. And you've got this really wonderful resume already, but we'd love to hear, who you are and kind of how you got to where you are today. So like the cliff notes on your career and as a policy guru in the conservation sector.
Yeah, so I mean, just starting when I was a kid, I grew up hunting and fishing. I'm originally from Indiana. So that was really the time that I bonded with my dad, right? So he always took me out. We went upland hunting for pheasant, chukar, quail. Grew up with English setters, ended up having a litter. So I trained my own that I got for a birthday one year. And then also, just grew up fishing a lot. So I owe that to my dad, and it's still our connection today. giving me a call when he gets out of the woods if he's frustrated after not seeing a turkey, or, he's in Michigan rough grouse hunting and there happens to be one on the side of the road when he saw nothing in the woods. So those conversations. And then, and then I even married into a very avid hunting family. So they're from Tennessee and they have a farm there, and we do a lot of more big game hunting. So it's part of my culture, part of who I am as a person, and part of my family traditions. And then on the policy side, I think that brings in my mom's side. So my grandfather was a government relations expert for a railroad company in DC. So he moved to Indiana when I was younger, so I heard all the great stories, and that really piqued my interest to do more in the government relations space and do more with policy and strategize as much as we could. So I think those two worlds really collided. But when I went to college in Tennessee, Swanee, the University of the South, and I studied history and got minors in German and international global studies. So it wasn't conservation, it wasn't poli-sci. It was one of those liberal arts colleges. But going to Capitol Hill, I think I had a better understanding of what policies I really enjoyed working on. And that led to agriculture and natural resources and conservation. And so that, ultimately led me to where I am. I've been, again, in the hook and bullet world for 9 years. Really enjoyed it. The nonprofit world, you meet some great people out there as well, and really have some amazing mentors that have taught me what I know today and kind of brought me to where I am with my career.
Yeah, I love the organic level of that, right? Like, I think that's what people sometimes don't always appreciate about, especially like thinking about any high school students that are thinking about careers in conservation, and like, was that what you wanted to do, right? I wanted to be a pilot. My eyesight was bad. That wasn't going to be a thing. Wanted to work in the outdoors, went into forestry. That wasn't a thing I wanted to do long term. And I found duck hunting midway through my undergraduate career, and then that just launched me. But one of the things that I never saw coming, and I work a lot with policy folks, right? And talk and think about policy and how that influences acres on the ground, not just for ducks, but for, all the land that keeps us a healthy country, both through quality farming practices as well as wildlife conservation and things like that. And now as a professor, I always talk to students very heavily about the Farm Bill specifically, and how policy is where kind of the rubber hits the road. Like, you could be in the science portion and you can give the information out objectively and stay out of the policy realm, which I think that's where I always lie, right? Like, if you think you're going to do science and then be an advocate, you've already soured your science. So what I always say is, you can do science or you can do policy and advocacy, but keep those two separate. But what a lot of students don't understand is, with that background in some level of wildlife science, conservation biology, environmental science, that you can then also tack on a professional kind of policy degree, right? So I try not to mix these things too much, but the Foul Weather podcast for my professional career are two separate things. But right next to ESF, where I teach, we also have the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. It ranks #1 in the nation in public affairs. And we currently are working to tie degrees at ESF between wildlife and that policy degree. So you can come out actually with a PhD in wildlife ecology and management, and an MBA from that school, right? So to me, this is like the ultimate package, right? It's like, and I've talked with some colleagues recently and CEOs of nonprofit organizations, as well as policy people and scientists. And I'm like, this is like all of you in one package going out the door. And I really think right, exactly. Right. Like, and you've done really, really amazing in your career, but like, imagine having that foundation ahead of time. I mean, it's pretty substantial. I think it's something we should be doing across the board. We we do a really good job of our science. Very often we don't even communicate it well in popular form, right? One of the reasons I started the podcast was to get good information out about, the duck world and duck culture and duck migration to the public. But you can make that your career with this really nice foundation out there. But just so on that, Julia, speak a little bit to, if we do have a lot of students and wildlife students that listen to the podcast. And so thinking about your progression and the importance of policy, maybe just speak to that with, on the platform of kind of, I think that I provided of the foundation of the wildlife science portion, and then how policy makes that happen on Capitol Hill and beyond, maybe to state level policy.
Yeah. So like I stated, I didn't have the wildlife background education. It's something that, I grew up with. So when you're in a field, you kind of see it. So mine are real world experiences of what I've learned. But also, when you're in DC, you kind of build your resume as well. So, I mean, I think that's really important to, talking about students, if you're able to come to DC or even, the state legislator and have those opportunities to intern or get a fellowship to learn more, about being in there. I mean, you can read textbooks all you want, but being there and having that real life experience, I think is really, really key. And I mean, one thing, you keep touching on students, and as a professor, I think students have such an impact to public policy. One that I think, is an untapped resource. And at Ducks Unlimited, we were trying to bring them more. We're leaning in more to younger generations and students and wanting them to be advocates for Ducks Unlimited. Like this is our fly-in February. This is the first time that we brought students in as kind of an experiment or a pilot to see how it would go with them interacting with our typical volunteers, our state chair policy leads. And it went really well. I mean, having students on Capitol Hill and, we have great relationships with members of Congress, but it's just a different conversation when you have a student in a room because you get the members' attention with the younger generations.
Mm-hmm.
Not only are they possibly constituents and the next voters, right? But I think they really hone in are interested, like, why are you, a young person, taking time out of your busy class schedule, your social life, to come here to DC and advocate for the ducks and advocate for conservation? So it's really intriguing and something that I think is key. And from me, when I still consider myself young, but when I first started, I think I can carry on those traditions and those legacies, but also, each generation has a different mindset. So like providing those positive changes to the programs, I think we need more and more of that in the hunting and fishing community, of how can we move dirt in a positive way that might be a little different and more innovative, but really beneficial to the fish and wildlife habitat. So overall, for policy and a position at Ducks Unlimited, it's very important. I don't think it's overall important. Conservation delivery team does a lot of work as well, but if you're thinking of Farm Bill, that's policy. The Farm Bill provides the most amount of funding for conservation on private lands. And private lands in America makes up about 60-70% of the land. And then we have wetlands that are majority on private land. So having influence on just the Farm Bill alone, I think, is really important. And like I said, it's a team effort. I'm not just sitting in my office in DC brainstorming, I think this would be a great idea. I work very closely with our teams across DU, particularly our conservation delivery team, and, developing our Farm Bill policy priorities. I ask them, through each program under the conservation title. I'm like, what's working, what's not working? You guys are the ones moving dirt. You're the ones that are having the conversations with producers and landowners. What can we change in statute? And if not in statute, through legislation, what can we work with administration to change? Maybe the NRCS handbook. What is needed to make sure that these programs are desirable and more effective and less burdensome for these willing participants to implement conservation on their land. So I think that's really key to our policy work, but it's also very much relationship oriented, right? So working with the administration, building those relationships, building the credibility and having honest conversations, and the trust is really important, even with Congress too. So I consider Ducks, my position as a shared service, if you will, to make sure that we're delivering our mission, because we can't do that without policy. And Ducks Unlimited's mission is really about restoring, conserving, and maintaining those wetlands and associated habitat. So policy is embedded in not only DU, but other NGOs, but even corporations. You know, it's a big concept that really helps move everyone's mission forward.
Yeah, and this is something that I really try to express to students a lot, and just the general public when I run into them, is when we talk about conservation, it's private lands are insanely important, and farmers, right? Agricultural lands cover a little more than 50% of the land base of the United States. So if you want to influence conservation through whatever you're doing, science or policy, you should very much be thinking about working on private lands. It's easier said than done sometimes, right? But certainly the Farm Bill is very much directed at, nearly 100% directed at private lands. So it's really, I think, the key portion of policy across this country for, well, it's food security, right? It's economic security, but it's also conservation and the security for sustaining duck populations as well. To this, key to this discussion, but goes well beyond that.
Absolutely. I think the Farm Bill, just for some 101 or some background, it passes hopefully every 5 years, but it hits a lot of different aspects of private lands and the whole supply chain. So I consider it as more of a safety net. So you might hit, commodity reference prices, you're hitting conservation, you're hitting trade, you're hitting nutrition for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, forestry, you're hitting kind of that whole broad swath of all these things that really impact the supply chain. Like you said, the national security and what I consider the safety net, right? And conservation is a big piece of that, because without the Farm Bill, a lot of producers would be relying on supplemental legislation, those packages, when a natural disaster happens. So if you're not preempting that through conservation programs that provide the resiliency for flooding or for drought or provide that water quality and quantity, they're going to be relying more and more on that, right? So, and just to throw out statistics, there's 140 million acres of land enrolled in Farm Bill conservation programs. And put that again in more perspective, that's the size of California and New York. So that's a lot of acres that people are willing to do. And these are voluntary programs, right? I mean, that's pretty exciting to see that all these landowners and producers want to be good stewards. So why not give them more tools in the toolbox to do so?
Yeah, so I'll just chuck this in there. You went with California and New York, and our listenership is like Arkansas, Missouri, Illinois, Indiana, Georgia. It's fine. It's fine.
I'm just thinking size, right?
You're good doing
I guess
size.
I could have been the whole Mississippi Alluva Valley, but yeah.
You're all good. There's a lot of duck hunters in New York, and there's a lot of duck hunters in California, despite what, politically some people think. It's fine. There's still rural folks that farm and hunt ducks and do all that stuff in those places as well.
Yeah.
I have to beat that drum a little bit, because being somebody who's producing a podcast from New York, I have to put, caveats on it of, we do duck hunt here, we do deer hunt, we do food plots. Like, we do still have a rural community beyond what politically you see on TV. So I just have to throw that out there to keep the listenership solid.
No. Yeah, I completely get that. And California, is probably some of the best duck hunting habitat, right?
It's insane how good it is. Yes.
But it's amazing.
Yeah.
If your listenership has not been in California to duck hunt yet, I highly recommend it. There's a lot of great opportunities out there.
Yeah. No, it's just good stuff. I appreciate the insight on just the importance of that private land component. And I really liked your comment. I'm going to take just a quick step back to like getting students on Capitol Hill. I think that is super cool. And the fact that, and I think that the senior folks that are there are going to eat that up, because the one thing I find when I bring students around that folks that are already in, professional positions want to see is well-trained students, and students that kind of uphold their values and think about conservation and think about farmers and think about, rural communities and things like that. And we always work, really hard towards that is to ensure that we've got this balanced, a balance of students going into the wildlife field in general, in the conservation field, where we've got folks that understand who duck hunters are, right? And because hunters are about 5%, but their voice is pretty strong, right? 5% of the U.S. population, but their voice is pretty strong, and they're a constituency that we should be paying attention to. And I always really try to make sure students get involved in that people on the policy end and anybody, I guess I'm just going to put quotes around this, like in a power position, understands that there are still young folks out there that care about these things, despite maybe what we see, again, media wise and things like that. Right. There is this constituency of kids that really care about things that you and I care about, Julia. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I'll tell a story too. I mean, when we had our fly-in, students were, at the beginning, we did some training. You could tell they were hesitant at first, didn't really fully understand the picture of why they were coming to DC. And then at the end, the confidence, I wish I had the confidence at their age. They were just so excited. We're able, like the senior volunteers that they were leading with, they just led the meetings, the students did. The senior volunteers allowed it to happen. They gained that confidence. They were still talking today about how much fun they had in DC and advocating. And there was one student, she makes me laugh. I mean, this is just a memory, but I was coming from to one of the Senate offices and going in for a meeting, and she came running out, huffing and puffing, and I was just like kind of wide-eyed, and she's like, "Oh my God, I just had a great meeting with Senator Stabenow. I mean, she's wonderful, yada yada." And then she finally took a breath, and I'm like, "Are you okay?" She's like, no, it was such a great meeting. She was so excited. And she's like, "I'm sorry, I just ran from the House side to get here for a meeting." And if you don't know the difference between the House and the Senate, right. There's House offices on one side and then the Senate offices on another, and then Capitol Hill, the building, the Capitol building's in the middle. That's usually like a 15, 20-minute walk. She ran that in 5 minutes to make sure she made it in time. And she was still 15 minutes early, but still huffing and puffing after the meeting. So those memories make everything worthwhile too, because they're so excited to be there and to advocate for something that's meaningful to them.
Hey, let me take a second and tell you about Wildlife Strategies, a top-of-the-line wetland habitat management company. Founder Ryan Delaney knows his stuff. With a degree in wildlife management from Mississippi State University, Ryan uses science-based solutions to create duck hunting properties that deliver results. On the Foul Weather Podcast, when we say, "May your skies be filled," well, Wildlife Strategies does just that, fills your skies with ducks. The Wildlife Strategies team sees your property through from the initial assessment and development of a 3-year timeframe management plan through annual check-ins and course corrections as needed. Don't want to deal with contractors or agencies like USDA, NRCS? No worries. Wildlife Strategies does all the contacts for you. Also included are seed and supply procurement, hunt management guidance, access to cutting-edge technology via agricultural drone, and expert mapping and aerial photography. Opting into the 3-year plan for an annual fee gives your duck property a leg up on others. Contact Ryan Delaney today at ryan@farmlg.com for a site visit. You're not going to be disappointed you did. Fill your skies with ducks with Wildlife Strategies. How do students get involved in that? Is that a voluntary thing, or what is it?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, this is the first time that we did it in February, because we wanted to see how it went. So worked very closely with our youth involvement team, mainly Scott McFerrin. He was amazing, and he got 12 students from across the country to attend that we thought would be appropriate. And they came here, they did wonderful. So I think we're going to continue that. And then we have our third term program that is a couple of days in Memphis at headquarters. We'll have a booth and explain everything more. But I think what we're going to try to do is not necessarily a scholarship. We're not going to call it that, but give something where students can apply for, and then they'll be able to have everything paid for to come to DC and have that opportunity, which is not only benefiting the ducks, but benefiting the student as well, because it's a huge networking opportunity for senior to interact with senior volunteers and legislative officials, if that's staff or if that's the member of Congress. but it's also a great resume builder. Having that experience, I think, is always important.
Oh yeah, I mean, I couldn't imagine how much that would have helped me. It took me a long time to get through just organic experiences to where these students are getting at in a very short period of time with y'all. So yeah, you mentioned third term. Just for listeners, I just want to make sure everybody understands that. So Ducks Unlimited has collegiate chapters, and they do fundraising. They do all kinds of activities. We have one at ESF in Syracuse, and so they'll do wood duck boxes, trail maintenance on national forests. They'll go out for days with NRCS to see how kind of wetland easement monitoring is done and things like that. I do a whole entire workshop on how to blow duck call, because some students they're fascinated with ducks, but they're not duck hunters, right? And so we kind of get them into that stuff. But third term, they come, the student chapters, the collegiate chapters, actually from across the country come to Memphis, and our students have been there almost every year since we started a chapter. Maybe it was the second year. And I guess it sounds like it's an amazing experience for the students to understand. It's kind of a rah thing. I'm going to admit that, but it is how to network, what Ducks does, why fundraising is important as far as the conservation machine goes, and then sends them back with tools to their universities to help, fundraise for acres for ducks, basically. I think that, is there anything I missed there, Julia?
No, I think that sums it up right, but I think you're correct. I mean, third term is just a very fun time for the students to really interact with each other, and have those conversations with like-minded people. That is very fundraising event heavy. That's why, from a policy perspective, we're leaning in a little bit more, and we'll have more of a presence this year, and then hopefully more so in the future.
Yeah, for sure. Get those folks really motivated and stay in the field. And we've had a ton of our students largely go work for DU, so we're kind of a pipeline ourselves. So it's been great. All right.
We appreciate you all.
Thank you so much. Well, we spread them all over. We got folks with BLM, we got folks with NRCS, Fish and Wildlife Service, but we're trying to put good, duck heads in good places. So, awesome. But let's get back into the Farm Bill, and I mean, it's your specialty, so we should cover that for sure, Julie. But I gotta admit, I mean, more than once, and even right before this interview, I just go down the rabbit hole regarding the Farm Bill. How it works or doesn't work at times for the
hard
American.
Not to. It's an easy rabbit hole.
Right. And I think it's really important for the American public, as we've discussed, and kind of for all the great people across duck country. And as we noted, a little over about 50% of our land is in agriculture. And so it greatly influences, I'd say, almost all processes in this country, maybe outside of the tech realm a little bit, right? But it definitely affects ducks and kind of all aspects of ducks' annual cycle, right? They need grass, they need wetlands. And agriculture influences availability of those habitats. But, ducks also need migratory stopover and wintering locations with wetlands. And they also, waterfowl also have adapted to exploit crops. So, what type of crops are planted, where, when, how they're harvested really affects the availability of duck foods on the landscape as well. So I might apologize sometimes for going down the rabbit hole too far when it comes to the Farm Bill, but it's really among the most important pieces of legislation that comes out of Capitol Hill when it comes to, I think, duck population stability throughout North America. I really do want to note that today we're pretty much going to ignore Canada in this discussion, but the Foul Weather Podcast is we're working on getting representatives to talk farming to the north and how it impacts ducks from our Canadian friends' perspective. Yeah. So when we think about their Farm Bill, our minds kind of go to CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, and WRP, which is now called, Julie, it's Wetland Reserve.
Wetland Reserve easements.
Easements, yeah. It used to be WRP, but it's changed now.
Yep.
But the Farm Bill history really isn't grounded in our current conservation practices. The history and evolution of the Farm Bill absolutely fascinates me because, this is a good one. I don't know if you know this. Migratory Bird Treaty Act originally was sold as we need birds because birds eat insects and insects eat crops. So if we want food to feed the war effort, we need birds, so they eat insects, so the insects don't eat the crops, right?
You really went down a rabbit hole, didn't you?
These are the weird, well, I teach it in ornithology, right? Like, what are the origins and how, because I try to be really upfront with students that, like, it's not just because people are good-hearted and they like birds. Like, there's other very self-serving goals that are embedded in a lot of this stuff. So you can't leave university thinking like this pie in the sky image, because you're going to fall on your face and you're going to fail. You have to have some of these realities of like, why did these things happen? Right. So all right, back up to the Farm Bill. That was a neat tidbit there. The history and evolution of the Farm Bill, it wasn't even called the Farm Bill, and the USDA didn't even exist. Right. So let's go back to that. So the history goes back to like World War II and the Korean War, and the demand for food was driving farm prices to record levels, right? So that's kind of what I've learned is the origination of the Farm Bill. And Julia will, I think, tell us more about it, but it eventually evolved into conservation of soil practices, and then finally incorporated like the conservation practices of like, say, CRP and WRP into what we consider the current Farm Bill, right? And Farm Bill is even short. So
it changes every time they pass one, whoever's in charge with leadership, they'll change the name of it. Like Stabenow for her framework has a different name. You have G.T. Thompson. So these are the chairs of the House Ag Committee, and then Stabenow with the Senate Ag Committee. So the name changes. That's why Farm Bill is always consistent. It's a good tool.
Well, I hear Food Securities Act, right, is one?
Yes. That is the Farm, Food, and National Security Act. That's the House bill that passed out of full Ag Committee right before the Memorial Day recess. Yep.
Okay. So can we go back and then like you can tell me how my history is wrong or right, and how like your telling of how the Farm Bill has evolved?
Yeah. So when I look at it, because there's so many different aspects and different ways that you can look in the lens of Farm Bill and why it's important, because like you said, national food security, I look at it because in the 1930s, on a domestic level, the Great Depression was happening. You also had the Dust Bowl, which was displacing a lot of producers from the land, and they didn't have a good understanding why. So the federal government had to step in to be like, we need you to stay on this land. Like, this is important for us to produce this food. We just need to find better practices for that. The soil erosion that was really taking over the Great Plains area, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, I'm going to put a little Ducks Unlimited history in there too, because we were founded in 1937 during the same time period when erosion, soil health was not key. So our founders wanted to provide that expertise to make sure, water was on the landscape and ducks were in the sky. So there's different motives, but that I like to focus more on the soil health side of it, because I think it is part of the original Farm Bill. It was more about commodity operations, right? The messaging around it was a little different. So fast forward to the 1970s, when it expanded a little bit beyond the commodity operations and started including other pieces that equal the Farm Bill today, to hit little pieces of the supply chain, right? And then in 1985 is really the first real time where conservation was addressed with the Conservation Reserve Program, which I think we can go into more detail later, but it really provided cover for to take highly erodible soils out of production. Mm-hmm. Was the main purpose, but also because of high commodity prices gave the landowner and the producer the ability to continue to hold the land, but still be profitable while they're not getting, paid for the commodity. So that was keeping the livelihood and the sustainability of the farm really was key there. And then through CRP, later in the 1980s, they started developing more eligibility ranks where restoring wetlands was a big piece of it. And then in the 1990s, WRE was created, and that started evolving. So WRP, like you said, it was originally the Wetland Reserve Program was created, and that really evolved, and that enrolled, close to 3 million acres in a decade or so. And then later in the 1990s is really when, policy started taking shape, especially in the conservation community, where conservation groups realized the Farm Bill is important, especially for private land conservation. So how can we be involved? So all these programs started developing, you talk about CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. There's also EQIP, the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. That's more working land, so you can continue producing your crop, but having maybe edge of field, riparian areas, livestock, water structures, fencing, what have you. Then the Conservation Stewardship Program, and then ASEP, which is the Agricultural Conservation Easement Program today, where now WRE, former WRP, is located. And I know there's a lot of acronyms out there, so bear with me. And Mike, please interrupt me at any time.
Let's go back and hit on one little single thing. And you keep using the term commodities, of which I have looked up because I've gone down the Farm Bill rabbit hole and interest in corn futures and all that stuff, and price per bushel for soybeans and corn and wheat and all that. I'm enthralled with it. It's like late on. I grew up with my grandfather had a vegetable farm in Western New York, and he actually ran the Buffalo. It was the Clinton Bailey Market in Buffalo, the farmers market for 30 years. But I was removed from that in a little forested town south of there, and so I grew up as more of like a woodsy type person than a farm. But I've kind of come back to it, right? And mostly because of this topic, Julia, right?
Yeah.
And so I understand commodities, and I watch like the price of corn, per bushel, because that influences whether we have folks interested in voluntarily enrolling in programs or not. Because when corn goes to whatever, did it hit like $8 a bushel or something? It was pretty astronomical at one time, right? There's just no incentive, because your risk of planting marginal lands is lower, right? So you're willing to take that risk, where otherwise it starts to make sense to take advantage of voluntary government programs. But I digress. Commodities. Can we hit on that one a little bit? Like, what is that term, and where did it come from in general?
Yeah. So I don't actually know the history of the commodity term, but I will say, commodities mean what is the row crop. So it could mean rice. It could mean your vegetables, which are more specialty crops. It could mean your fruits like blueberries or cherries. It could mean cattle, your livestock. It means dairy. It's really what is your product that you're selling is the commodity in the farm community.
Yeah, you ran through a fair number of acronyms, but they're all just programs, within the Farm Bill that are very specific. They're on-farm type things like nutrient management, cover crops. There's lots of, those a number of, they're like multifaceted, and a lot of it is, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's like really helping farmers out so that, given that they're 50% of the land base, that they can produce food and other products that are beyond food, obviously, that crops are used for, but also keep a healthy landscape for the American public, and also ensure their own security as farmers, so we don't lose farms too.
And I guess the point that I was making, for the conservation programs that you mentioned and the acronyms I mentioned are all in their conservation title, right? And it's really, these are voluntary. So it's really up to the landowner and the producer who want to implement this on the ground. And it provides more, for example, WRE, the Wetland Reserve Easements. There's so many benefits that come with a 30-year easement or perpetual easement that you can do. One is more sustainable for the producer and the landowner. So let's say you have marginal land, but you want to make your best bang for your buck, and you're not producing what you need to produce on that land, you can enroll it into the easement. And that means when you're enrolling the easement, you're saving on other Farm Bill programs, you're saving on seeding cost. So it provides you that financial stability to maintain that land and keep ownership of that land, I think is really important. The other thing that you're doing as a landowner, you're being a great steward, right? So you're talking about not only being for your own livelihood and for your family's livelihood, but for the communities around you. So, for Ducks Unlimited, we really implement a lot of WREs in the Mississippi River Valley, is primarily because, for bottomland hardwood forest, trying to really restore those lands is really important to us. And having a WRE, once it's restored and being maintained well, you're preventing that runoff that is going into the Mississippi River, which is very important because the runoff contributes to Gulf hypoxia at the end of the day. So you're helping with cleaner water, you're helping with water storage, you're helping with more resiliency for those communities along the Mississippi River, because it's that nature-based solution. Wetlands are for, protects them from flooding, because a wetland is a floodplain, and you can, help with that. Helps with drought because of water storage. So there's a lot of multiple benefits, what we at Ducks Unlimited call the ecosystem services that we try to provide through our wetland and grassland work on the ground. But another key component is, since it is voluntary, it's really up to the landowner of what they want to do with the land. You hear a lot of times that they just want to make the land better than when they got it for the next generation. And those conservation programs really allow to do that for their kids or their grandkids or future great grandkids. They want to keep it in the family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the farm the best and conserve the rest, I always really liked. And it's, I don't know. I mean, we produced, I don't know how many billion bushels of, I'd have to look at the number again. And we reported it here in the corn episode. We did a whole episode on corn, by the way. It was positives and negatives for ducks, right? There's both sides of that coin, so we can't ignore that. But the thought here is that we seemingly right now are producing, I don't know, this is a little off topic, but it goes in the Farm Bill. Like there's more. This is the rabbit hole I go down with commodities and thinking about them too. But like the amount of storage of corn right now waiting for prices to go up. I mean, demand seems to be there, but farmers are just holding and holding and holding corn. And if we get another growing season, we're going to just produce another bumper crop of corn. And then that's just going to, it's a supply demand thing, right? And that's just going to drive prices lower. And, some of that, it just seems to be that, maybe we were, farming the best plus a little bit extra at times. And there is incentive at times to do that, especially when prices are high. So it's a weird thing to say, is somebody who cares about farmers, comes from a farming community background, to say, boy, it would be really nice to see prices come down so that we'd have more interest in voluntary programs for conservation, for grass and things like that, right? And it's this, I'll let you comment on that. It's kind of like an open-ended, but it feels right now with how high prices get, it seems like the market's more volatile than it used to be, and it's just harder to, my feeling is like we're going to bounce back and forth from a lot of acres in voluntary programs to not a lot, and then back and forth. And previously it felt more stable than it is now, but I don't know if that's reality or it's just me from the outside going down too many rabbit holes.
Yeah, I think when you look at the numbers, especially with the Conservation Reserve Program, like a couple years ago, there was high prices for wheat because of the Ukrainian war, right? And Ukraine is a big world producer for wheat. So there was a lot of conversations and a lot of folks that were advocating for FSA, the Farm Service Agency that oversees CRP, to allow termination of contracts so people could put their land back in production. The thing is, the land circulates a lot. A lot of people enroll and then take it out of production. I mean, there are studies that show that only 25% of it actually stay re-enrolled over and over again. So there's some misunderstandings out there that I highly recommend people to look into and educate themselves on of what the CRP is. But like you said, I mean, commodity prices go up and down. It's just like history repeats itself all the time with the market, supply and demand. And it's really hard for programs like CRP to try to keep up with that, right? So when high commodity prices, you're probably going to see less land enrolled, which is fine. Again, it's a voluntary program, right? If that's what the producer wants, that's great. But, the program is there as a safety net if they want to enroll their land that is maybe not as productive as it once was for a 10 to 15 year contract. I think that's really important. I will say more and more acres under CRP are being enrolled in what is considered grassland CRP, which is mainly doesn't do all the restoration and all those practices that really create that nesting and duck habitat, but does allow more of the working lands component that I think CRP is slowly evolving into, which we at Ducks Unlimited support. So it allows that grazing to happen on that land, which people really appreciate, so they can do rotational grazing. And there's more and more studies out there that grazing benefits ducks.
Yep.
So one of my colleagues in the Great Plains, he's a rancher, Ryan Taylor, and he likes to say what's good for the ducks is good for the cows, which is very accurate. When you have grazing, you have more native variety of vegetation. It's great nesting habitat. So that is something that's key. But going back to prices right now, there's so much being more enrolled in grassland CRP, and the incentives just aren't there for CRP. And that's why, at least what I'm doing for this farm bill under CRP, is working to modernize the program, to streamline it, to make it more easily understandable to producers and landowners, but also to make sure that these incentives are increased. So rental payments for particular marginal land is increased, so it's more competitive with the current market. And also to make sure that's locally led. They need to make sure that, you're having those conversations on a local level to see what is needed for habitat, and what practices should be implemented, I think is really important for a program specifically like CRP.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby, and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Yeah, you hit on two really good points there, I think. And one is that, and I like that you said the science is showing that grazing of cattle and duck production are compatible. Because, and this is one thing I try to get across to people, is that, farmers are going to farm. And it's either row crop or it's cattle. There's other alternative uses, obviously, right? But prairie wise, where most of our ducks are coming from, it's not like they're going to be like, oh, okay, well, I just quit. It's not the farmer mentality, right? And so putting cattle on grasslands that are compatible in rotational grazing, that's compatible with duck production, and even when they're grazing, like all the studies on like do nests get trampled, things like that, it really shows that it's negligible, if not exactly the same as grassland that's not grazed. So ducks and cows, cows feeding on grass are definitely compatible. The one other so that's part A of the first one. Part B of the first one is that we're not getting, when we think about prairies, native grassland's fantastic, but the likelihood of getting it back is really low, right? We're not going back to like giant herds of bison roaming across the prairies. It's a totally different landscape. And so cattle are somewhat of a replacement for that. And they're better than it all being in row crop, for sure, for ducks. For there being grass on the landscape. The second one that you mentioned that I really like is this is all bottom up stuff, right? I like to think about it at the local scale. I cringe a little bit because I don't want to get in the weeds politically about this at all, but there's a little too much top down still in some of this that I think producers feel forced into. I'll leave it at that. But the point is that I like the local scale comment that you made, because that's where we have to do this, right? This is a voluntary program, and the people themselves have to be invested and feel empowered to be involved in this process. The Farmland Group has handled over $400 million in farm sales across the Mid-South and recently added some spectacular wildlife management expertise, particularly for waterfowl and waterfowl hunting, to their diverse portfolio. Maybe you want to get started with a new duck hunting property, or maybe you want to enhance an existing property to peak performance. Look no further than the Farmland Group. With licensed agents and affiliated relationships, the Farmland Group is ready to assist clients across the states of Arkansas, Mississippi, Missouri, Louisiana, Tennessee, Alabama, and Georgia. You've been thinking about it for years. No need to put it off anymore. Build your duck club dream with the Farmland Group. Their expertise doesn't stop at sales. They also have extensive lending relationships with the biggest farmland and recreational lenders in the country, as well as a staff appraiser that can assist in helping value your property. Find the Farmland Group today at farmlg.com. That's farmlg.com. Carrots are way better than sticks, right? Bottom up is way better than top down. Top down doesn't work. We know that. And I disagree with high levels of regulatory jurisdiction, whatever you want to call it. So I really liked those 2 points. Cattle grazing, spot on, works with ducks. And bottom up works and top down doesn't. So I didn't have a question there. It was just more of a follow-up comment.
No, I'm happy. Yeah. I mean, I'm happy that you're emphasizing all that, because I think that's really important, because in past years, I mean, cattle, we just didn't have the research. We didn't have the science for grazing management. And now we do, and we can just use that as another tool in our toolbox. And it's a great partnership that we have. You know, we work very closely with the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. We have an MOU with them. And if it's not in the field and implementing and delivering conservation, it's on a policy front. Like, how can we work together to advocate for conservation, but also help them advocate for other aspects of the Farm Bill to be a good partner?
Yeah. No, it's good stuff. Did we cover everything CRP wise you wanted to talk about? I mean, there's, a lot of folks think it's, primarily grassland conservation program, but what is it? I think we covered what it is to farmers. Is there any leftover material here that you want to touch on with CRP for folks?
Yeah, I think just kind of a fun fact for CRP to bring it down to the hunter understanding of it. A lot of people don't realize that CRP acres are really prime habitat that you access for hunting. So when I go to the Eastern Shore, I'm hunting on a CRP land. When my family goes to South Dakota to hunt pheasant, we're hunting on a CRP land. That CRP land provides great habitat and it's just wonderful for hunters. And I think sometimes, you might not see that sign that says CRP or that's enrolled in CRP. So it's just nice from an understanding, like when you're in the field, you could be hunting on a CRP land or any of these other conservation program lands, because they provide you that great habitat and those opportunities on the ground. I think is really important to flag.
Yeah, that's a great comment. It's not just wildlife habitat; it's human habitat too, right? In places for us to recreate. So,
and then another, element of that is, generating the local economy. I mean, it takes gas, it takes hotels to go to those places to have that hunting experience and that opportunity. So you're really doing value to the local economy and the local community.
Yeah. No, I beat that drum all the time, is that these rural communities often live and die by this, recreational tourism, fishing and hunting being large contributors, because as hunters and fishermen, hook and bullet folks, I think I saw a funny meme the other day. It was like, on average, people spend $250 on recreational activities each year. And I was like, that's funny, because I certainly spend more than that.
Yeah. I mean, that would be my one license that I got for one particular species.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Hey, so, what's new in the current Farm Bill that works for ducks? I actually dug in, again, rabbit hole stuff. Republicans on the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, I am reading this, by the way, released their framework for a new 5-year farm bill last Tuesday that will set the policy and funding levels for key food, agriculture, and conservation programs. And priorities included in that included increased spending for conservation programs. So, any little highlights of what that might mean for the ducks?
Yeah, so let me take a step back because there's a lot of things coming out, frameworks here, bills here. So
yeah, it's busy right now.
Yeah, it's a busy time for Farm Bill.
Certainly.
So there is one bill out there, legislative text out there, and that's the House Farm Bill. That's the Farm, Food, and National Security Act that passed out of full committee right before Memorial Day, and it is bipartisan. It had 4 Democrats in support of it, so passed on 33-21. That is something that DU, we put out a statement in support of the conservation title. So the conservation title, we've got everything that we advocated for in there. And it came together in a bipartisan manner, which I think, is very key to the understanding, because at the end of the day, we want to see a bipartisan bill passed, right? Republican and Democrats negotiating a bill, but they've worked for over 2 years on the conservation title, and that is a product of it. So I'm really proud of what the committee was able to do and complete there. And then on the Senate side, you have frameworks or outlines. So with Senator Stabenow, she is the chairwoman of the Senate Ag Committee, and she came out with a framework that is more in detail. I think it's like 6 or 7 pages for their conservation title. It also included Ducks Unlimited priorities. So we are in support of that because it highlighted things that we have been advocating for. And then the one you're referencing is Ranking Member John Bozeman put out last week, which is a 1-pager for each title of what they would like to cover. And again, we've had statements of support for that because it's moving the needle forward, right? We want to make sure that they're still having conversations, and this is something showing that they are bringing forward their priorities, and hopefully it will have multiple conversations to hopefully bring them to the table to negotiate a little bit more. And then hopefully, by lame duck or after the election, we can see a bill, go to conference, get the House bill and the Senate bill to align and see something before the end of the Congress. Because, from a conservation perspective, this is a big historical moment for conservation. We need to get a farm bill done this year because there's a huge influx of dollars. For folks that might be familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, there's about $14.5 billion left in that. And all of that would go into the conservation title. So we would see a 25 to 30% increase in conservation funding over time. So that's 10 years and beyond. That is huge because right now we get $6 billion a year, 60 billion over a 10-year span. That's how they calculate the budget. Right. So it's great. That's 6% of the farm bill currently, but imagine what you can do with the additional funding for conservation on the ground. So it's a huge moment. And the longer we wait, the less money there is in that pot to bring into the farm bill. So just something I'm mindful of and advocating for. But then also, from Ducks Unlimited, we have a couple of priorities that we've been advocating for. So one being WRE, we've really wanted stewardship opportunities, so codifying that. If I get into the weeds, please stop me and ask questions. But for WRE, there's
You're good.
Okay, good. 2 buckets. There's the acquisition bucket, and then there's the restoration bucket for funding. So restoration is different from stewardship because that happens between 1 and 5 years of closing of the easement. So let's say you want to plant trees. That's when you're going to do that project. Down the line for stewardship, we want that included as a permanent bucket because let's say you have a 30-year easement or a permanent easement, 20 years down that road, your trees have grown and you need to thin it out. So having those opportunities and those practices available for you, I think is really important to maintain and have quality habitat, because if you're just letting the easement sit there, it's not beneficial to the landowner, not beneficial to the community, not beneficial to the taxpayer, right? So let's make sure that it's still prime habitat and being beneficial all around. The other thing that we're also advocating for, which is CRP that I touched on, better incentives, locally led. Advocated for the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which I haven't touched on yet, but that is very significant for Ducks Unlimited because it helps really implement our rice stewardship partnership with USA Rice. making sure rice producers are having nutrient management, making sure that they're being sustainable and profitable while also flooding and providing great duck habitat. We're just, it's a great program. We just need some flexibility in how we're spending some of the administrative side of things, because from DU, we're trying to implement these programs, but if we don't have certainty on how much we need to spend, because it changes from each application, from each project, from each negotiation, if we don't have that certainty, we can't balance our budget. So we really don't know the amount of people that we need for capacity and all that. So I know that's more technical, but that is a big issue for Ducks Unlimited that we're advocating for.
Yeah, it gets in the weeds a little bit, but these are the important nuances, right? Like if you're talking about restoring bottomland hardwoods, you can't, none of this stuff is just a do it and walk away thing, right? That midstream management, right? That midstream interaction with that location, with those trees, with whatever it is, right, is necessary. And so having that flexibility in there is certainly important. So I like the very, I think, proactive and even going into the weeds a little bit avenue of DU. And again, grounded in the science basis that DU works on, right, as well, to know what produces ducks, what sustains ducks during migration, and what makes sure they have good winter habitat to kind of send them back strong as well. So all those key components seem to be there. And so, the weeds are important, I guess, is the bullet point there, right?
Yeah. And I think it's also important, you're talking about flexibility. That's something that we really honed in on, because for equip practices, you might have a cover crop that's great for, a soybean producer or corn producer, but a cover crop's not going to work for a rice producer, right? So make sure that those flexibilities are there within the programs, I think is also really important to note. And then, I think this time around for the Farm Bill, we're not, from a DU standpoint, we're not asking for anything completely innovative. We're trying to be very much, let's make sure we're tweaking these programs to make them more efficient and effective, and really focused on these existing lands that we have enrolled. Let's make sure we're managing them, because we do have a lot of land enrolled in easements, a lot of working lands, a lot of lands enrolled of CRP, but how can we manage them a little bit better to get more bang for our buck and make sure that it's being profitable?
Yeah, I've worked a lot. And published on, that was research in Mississippi and then elsewhere on what, post restoration under WRP as well as NAWCA, North American Wetlands Conservation Act funds, and then we found ways to do, post construction monitoring years later to understand what was needed management wise. And to a large degree, one of the issues folks have struggled with is it gets built and then there is no assistance thereafter, and individual landowners knowing how to manage their own property and do that midstream kind of adaptation is asking a lot. And so having something built in that enables that to get the most out of what already exists, right? Like it makes way more sense from a business model perspective than just throwing more money at something that's okay. It's better than nothing, but it could be better. Let's do what we're doing already a little bit better. I did not, that's news to me, right? So I appreciate that perspective, Julia. I like that idea. Yeah,
of course.
So we've covered a lot of ground that I had questions on. I think a lot of organic ground, but maybe, wrap us up by, I guess, to use long-term vision in your policy range for sustaining ducks. And I'm going to go with like the big one, right? In an ever-present changing landscape where we just seem to need more food or yield from the landscape for more people, and more so in like this global thing. You mentioned the Ukraine stuff, right? There's things that are going to T-bone us that we don't see coming. So how do we sustain a landscape for people? How do we feed people? How do we keep farmers on the landscape? And how do we keep ducks in that mix? My goodness, that's a giant question.
That is a big question.
Have at it.
From my standpoint, long term, from DU, our mission has never changed, right? I don't think we're going to change that mission of who we are and what we do. I think how we implement it and how we message it might change depending on administration, depending on where the world is and what is needed. And I think, I think one thing that we always need to keep in mind is wetlands. How are we keeping wetlands on the landscape? Because that keeps the ducks in the sky, right? And right now, if you're familiar with the Fish and Wildlife Status and Trends report, it comes out every 10 years, but the most recent one came out a couple months ago. And in the last 10 years, 50% of wetlands have declined.
It's not good.
It's not good.
It's not good
at all.
No.
And I mean, there's kind of an urgency and, educational opportunity for us to really elevate that. And it led us to working with this current administration and said, what are we doing about wetlands? Like, it needs to be more of a priority. And they've created a challenge that they are challenging themselves to conserve 8 million acres of wetlands, which gives us the opportunity long-term of what that would look like, right? So we're trying to protect wetlands at all costs, but we also want to do it in a framework that is consistent with what is going on in the world now. It has to be voluntary, it has to be incentive-based, right? Because we really need buy-in from the landowners and the producers to really make this work. So how can we work and partner with the producers and the landowners and our other corporate commodity partners to advocate for wetland restoration and, protecting those really critical resources, I think is where we are now. And we're striving in the right direction of implementing things. We have a great partnership with NRCS and doing a couple agreements on the ground there and trying to implement that, trying to create some interagency collaboration for inventory of wetland mappings, I think is really critical. So we got a couple of things in the work but those are the things that are always on my mind of like, how are we going to keep the wetlands on the ground, but also make these programs desirable for the producer and landowner to want to keep the wetlands on the ground.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
I was never really a runner. The way I see running is a gift, especially when you have stage 4 cancer. I'm Anne. I'm running the Boston Marathon, presented by Bank of America. I run for Dana-Farber Cancer Institute to give people like me a chance to thrive in life, even with cancer.
Join Bank of America in helping Anne's cause. Give if you can at BofA.com/supportAnne. What would you like the power to do? References to charitable organizations is not an endorsement by Bank of America Corporation. Copyright 2025.
Yeah, that's a tall task. And
easier said than done, for sure.
Easier said than done. I mean, our neighborhood, I've started a turkey project, right? We have turkey decline. I mean, it's separate, but similar. I mean, we are. I didn't think we'd be in a place in the Northeast U.S. where, hedgerow removal and even whole blocks of forest removal continue to be a thing. And I struggle with the voluntary end of it all the time. And I think it's why it has to be very well developed, right? Because coming from the mentality of a farmer, I mean, I don't want to take I'll just even say, sections of my place and not make it as productive as possible. Okay, so I farm birds sometimes. So, but my mentality is I am quote unquote farming, but I'm doing it in a way that is producing as many of X as I want, right? And X for me is birds, turkeys and deer food plots. And, I make, let's say, indigo bunting habitat, which sounds foreign to people, but it's a thing we do because I just, love birds. So I farm them. Now think about that from a farmer perspective. I have been with students before that look at a cornfield and say, isn't that beautiful? Like the perfect rows. And you can see the yield's going to be awesome. And I'm like, wait a second. But that's the mentality, is getting the most out of that piece for what your priority is. And so I think we struggle with, what what we incentivize, how we get it done, and how we get to people to voluntarily also understand that, wetlands, grasslands are largely important and a thing that we should be focused on, voluntarily producing for the long term. That's the thing I always try to get people to think about, is like, not just in your lifetime, but like long term, what's the legacy you're leaving? But I'm trying to talk around it, but the comment is from a farmer perspective, I don't blame them for farming from hedgerow to hedgerow and ripping out hedgerows to farm more, because they're just doing what I do differently.
Yeah.
And I think we have to come to terms with the fact that we can't blame. We have to think about it from the perspective of the person, and get in their shoes and find a way within the Farm Bill to get them to voluntarily be involved in that process and be engaged, right? Lack of engagement is the biggest enemy, probably.
Yeah, and I think also going to an earlier point, like honing in locally led is really key to that. I mean, when you're having those local conversations, there's some credibility and trustworthiness that you might not see from, a top-down approach.
Mm-hmm.
I think is something that we always need to remember, but also, relationship building and partnership. There's like a lost art, a lost skill in having those conversations and building relationships and educating people on some of these great opportunities and the science that's out there. I think we need to do more and more of that, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of what we're doing here today, right? It's all about, and I think I think Ducks Unlimited does an amazing job of getting their voice out there. They really do. And a lot of nonprofits do as well. Academics, we don't. And people think I'm crazy for even doing this podcast. They're like, "You did what?" I'm like, "Yeah, I just had free time on Sundays, so I figured I would." Right. I don't need to really have a life otherwise, right? So, but yeah, getting this message out. And what I always say to people is, don't be afraid to have these conversations and share this information, because that's how it travels. It travels from person to person. The internet's fine, but good discussions with neighbors and things, and helping each other understand how to keep, a quality landscape for ducks and for people. And those things are not mutually exclusive. I always say, as ducks go, so do humans, right? So I think we kind of live and die hand in hand. So I really appreciate, Julia, what you're doing. Again, don't envy you in the least. It's a tall task, and appreciate your time on Capitol Hill and the fact that it sounds like you still get outside once in a while. Maybe you're a little ways away from duck country in your part of the world, but I think sounds like you still deer hunt a little.
So you can go to the Eastern Shore, but you do need to have a lease. And I do have a 2-year-old daughter, so my priorities have shifted a little bit in the last couple of months. But yeah, I do a lot of grouse hunting, upland hunting, deer hunting. I do waterfowl hunting. I just didn't have the most successful year last season. And
no one did, don't worry.
That's what I've been told. So I'm trying not to feel too bad for myself. But then at the end of June, so next week I will be in the Gulf for our annual Peebles red snapper fishing trip. So always look forward to that in May or June. So I try to get out. It's part of our, again, like I said, it's part of our tradition and our family time and our vacation. So it just also makes me feel better when I come back into the city. I know why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? It's important to have those natural areas, natural landscapes, to really have that quality habitat and fisheries.
Yeah, such a cool message. Thank you for that. And I'm going to plug the Foul Weather podcast, because in the summer months here, we're doing all these, very informative podcasts and such. But in the fall, we do produce the only duck migration forecast available. So we produce using the best science that's out there. I would say the only models which predict where ducks are going to be. We do that for a 7-day period. We put them out on Sunday, so it's your whole week of hunting. And we put a forecast out for the central Mississippi and Atlantic flyways, and it helps you pick kind of your best days to be able to go hunting. And so what I'm thinking about, Julie, is like for you or other people that are really busy, what we're trying to do to some extent is give people this opportunity to go enjoy that resource, and then also do the busy work like what you do, right? Get back behind the desk and things like that, and maybe get kids out on a good day. I had a a friend that I ran into a lot down the road at the refuge that we hunt at, and I was thinking back. I talked to him the other day because he's also a seed dealer in the off season, and he's like, you basically predicted last year 5 good days for us for like really good migration, specifically of mallards into our area, and he's like, you hit 4 of them. You hit 4 of them. 4 of the days were great. That one day you and I were both in that wetland and it was horrible. And I'm like, yeah, I don't know what happened. Like the sun came up. He stayed and killed like 3 or 4 ducks. I left. Like I hit like 8:30 and I'm like, I'm out. There's nothing. I got other stuff to do. So I left. But point being is that the basis of the podcast is, to entertain and inform. So this is the information perspective and hopefully some entertainment. You've been a great guest. But during the season, we're doing those predictions, which help. I mean, I'd say folks like yourself find those days that are a little better than others, especially if people have flexible schedules where they can escape the office once in a while. So, yeah.
Yeah, of course. And appreciate you doing all that work for us hunters. I mean, it's needed. So appreciate it.
You know what it was, is I was just doing it myself. And I noticed that I was being more efficient in my time out. So I figured, why not just push it out the door? I always tell my students this too. I'm like, if you have something you do that's different than anybody else, find a way to make it into, something bigger for your career. So it's what we shot for. So yeah. Hey, Julia, it's been awesome and really appreciate your time. I know you're a very busy person, so thank you for coming on. Thank you for being an awesome representative of DU and a supporter of everything that Ducks does to put acres on the ground, keep our skies filled. So the way that the podcast always ends is, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends. Do you think you can take us out?
I can, but I first do want to thank you. Thank you so much for this opportunity and explaining a little bit more about the Farm Bill from a duck perspective. But I will close this by saying, may your skies be filled and shoot straight, my friends.